My name is Joni Bishansky, and on behalf of the Woods College of Advancing Studies at Boston College, I welcome you to today's event, Healthcare Cybersecurity, Protecting Sensitive Data, Research, and Patients while Navigating the Regulatory Landscape. This event is co-sponsored by the Healthcare Administration Graduate Program, for which I am a director, and the Cybersecurity Policy and Governance Graduate Program. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce you to today's moderator, my esteemed colleague and friend, Professor Kevin Powers, the founder and director of the Cybersecurity Policy and Governance Program. Kevin.
Thanks, Joni. And I like the phrase esteemed. And yeah, I appreciate all your support, everything we're doing. You've been a great friend at BC and a great colleague, and looking forward to doing many more of these together. Thank you. All right, everyone. Scott and Tim, you can show your screens when you would like to jump on. And what I'll do is kind of give a quick intro, and then we'll jump right into the panel discussion. All right, so this is the fifth in a series of webinars this year that we've had. And we're back at it after the fifth annual Boston Conference on Cybersecurity. 2 weeks later, we're out of the gate with another panel discussion with two experts here to discuss healthcare security. Ground rules as we move forward, just like our regular panels. You can ask questions as we move along. Just use the chat. We'll get to them. If they're flowing or out of sync, we'll still get to them, and we'll open up for questions at the end of our panel discussion. We really want things interactive. It will be painful if it's just me, Tim, and Scott talking here. We really want to hear from you, so bring those questions on. Learning objectives. Really keeping it simple. We want to identify and describe the regulatory landscape as it applies to healthcare. We're going to talk about current threats against healthcare industry. We'll talk about a little bit about telehealth, and then enterprise cybersecurity as it relates to the healthcare industry. And most importantly, and this is the whole reason you're here, why should you care? Well, it's not only your bottom line if you're an organization, but it's also patient care. Like literally, lives are at stake here when we talk about cybersecurity in the healthcare industry. So with that, I'm going to introduce our two panelists. First, we have a great friend, colleague, and Boston College Law School alum, Scott Lashway. Scott's also on our BC Cybersecurity Advisory Board, and Scott's the managing partner for the Boston office of Manat, Phelps, and Phillips. He's also co-chair of the Data Privacy and Security Practice Group. Scott, before we jump in, then we're going to get to Tim. Instead of me blabbing on about your background, why don't you tell us a bit about yourself, what you do in the healthcare industry, and really how you got there.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin, and thanks, Joni, for having me as well. I've been dealing with data-related legal issues for about 20 years since I started practicing law. I think before it became known as cybersecurity in the legal space, we dealt with data destruction, data use, data sharing, most frequently on behalf of healthcare clients and financial services clients. They were, at least in my experience, the first industry sectors that were heavily reliant on data. And so it's where I've spent a lot of my practice. We represent companies from all varieties, including companies that support those industries. And so we've done a lot of work in the security space from the legal perspective and from the consulting perspective, Kevin, as you know. And then we also do a lot of work on the privacy side, and Manat has a very sizable healthcare practice and healthcare consulting practice, including with privacy professionals that focus exclusively on healthcare.
All right, thanks, Scott. And now we have Dr. Tim Stettheimer. Tim is here. I can't believe you're here after you send a note that you just, a tornado blew through your backyard about 20 minutes ago. So I'm impressed with that. So any students who are supposed to be here today, it's inexcusable if they come back with anything other than a tornado. Tim is the vice president and he's with the Education College of Health, Care Information Management and Executives, CHIME. He's also a professor here in Joni's program in the Master of Health Administration here at Boston College. Tim has a wealth of experience, and I'm going to let Tim, tell you a bit about himself.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. I don't know, Scott and I may want to compete for how far back we go. I was trying to count, Scott, as you were talking about decades. I think 20, 25 years. But yes, pleasure to be here. And I did have a tornado come through right over there. Although I wasn't at my desk, I was huddled with my wife and our dog in the mechanical room over there.
If the dean's on board right now, if Karen's on board, we need to get you a raise just for that.
Well, I'll take that. I'll take that.
Duty pay.
Well, and we don't have internet, so this is off my iPad and cellular. Although it seems to be doing good, so we're going to go for it. And I've tried to turn off all the dings because we have family and friends who are doing all the check-ins and things here, but we're good, so we're safe. And Karen is telling you to be careful.
I saw that. Watch what you promised. I didn't promise anything.
There you go. Yeah, she may come to you for those extra funds. And I'm not cheap. I'm just saying, I'm not cheap. So I am privileged to work with the College of Healthcare Information Management executives full-time and lead all of their education efforts. What they are is a professional association of senior IT leaders in healthcare. That includes CIOs, chief information security officers, chief application officers, I've been doing that for about 3 years, but I've been a member of this organization for more than 20 because I spent the prior 2 decades as a chief information officer in healthcare. So I've been in healthcare, obviously, since before that, but appreciate being able to be here and just talk a little bit about all these important issues because they are even becoming of more significance, frankly, over the last year with what's been happening. So we can talk more about that, though.
Awesome. Thanks, Tim. And really thank you for being here today, all kidding aside. All right, so let's jump right in here. So Scott, I'll start with you. Let's talk a bit about HIPAA high tech. If you could, give us a brief background, general view for our audience here. What do we mean by HIPAA and high tech, and who does it apply to?
Yeah, so these are kind of corollary federal laws, high tech being the most recent, HIPAA being one of the older privacy statutes out there in the US. And high tech was passed in 2019 as part of the recovery from the 2008 bust, which gave HIPAA a little bit more oomph from an enforcement perspective and increased the potential fines and breach notification obligations when you have security incidents. So we often see them kind of read in conjunction. Also did some expansion of HIPAA to business associates, so those persons who are receiving personal health information as defined by HIPAA. HIPAA generally is that regulation when you walk into a hospital and there's notifications all over the walls, and when you're filling out those long forms and there's a privacy notice in there that says, here's what we're going to collect about you, and you have some rights under federal law. That's HIPAA, and you have to sign it and provide consent for that organization to collect your data and to use it in connection with the services they provide you. Of course, the prevalence of data, the reliance on data in the healthcare sector necessitates some regulation as to what organizations can and cannot do with that information. It's obviously some of the most sensitive and personal information about you. And it used to be your name and your age and your weight and your height and all the things that we would tell our medical provider. But we know now that there's a lot more baked into the services that healthcare organizations provide, whether it be audio recordings and voice print, whether it be facial recognition, whether it be DNA collected through either wet or dry blood spots. The world's the limit for the healthcare space. And so the handling and collection of that data is really important. And it's really important for organizations to use these opportunities to help limit their potential liabilities by telling people what they're going to do. So that's largely HIPAA and high tech. It's something we live with. Obviously, it's quite complicated. And that's at the federal level, and that's personal health information. We'll talk a little bit about what I think we'll talk a little bit about what all that stuff means.
Yeah,
that's a high level overview.
Yeah, and when you talked about, that's at the federal level, right? So a lot of people think like, hey, that's HIPAA protected data. So they talk about like, hey, I have my Fitbit, I'm running, and if something happens, I'm protected by HIPAA. But that's actually really not the case at all. But there are actually laws out there that protect us, or allegedly protect that information. And I'm looking at like state laws or the FTC laws that are out there. But for purposes here, when we talk about HIPAA, high tech, there's different entities like a covered entity or a business associate. It's really specific who it applies to. But here for this audience today, we're going to be talking about healthcare in general and what we need to do to protect our data. All right, so
just note there are a lot of state laws that apply to health information as well, whether it be things like the California Privacy Act or actual healthcare specific laws, and some of those came out during the 80s when there was a stigma about being HIV positive, and some states wanted to extend some privacy protection to those individuals so that those diagnoses would be protected and those patients wouldn't have to feel pressure or the concerns around those stigmas. And some of those laws are still in the book. So there are a lot of state laws too. And so you end up in these 50 state survey issues where you have to figure out one state to the next who has what rights versus the other.
Right, and that's too, is the attorney generals of each state too can bring healthcare claims under HIPAA or high tech. Plus, a lot of times, if they're not going to use the HIPAA, they're going to use their equivalent of consumer protection law, like in Massachusetts 93A, which is really unfair deceptive practices, what we see from the FTC.
Yeah, and as a litigator, somebody who's in court and somebody who does investigations, we're always looking at the risk. And not just the compliance. So what does it mean to comply? And under HIPAA, Kevin, you're right. The state attorneys general have an ability to enforce those protections through the high tech law, but individuals don't have a private right of action under HIPAA. So you see, big privacy class actions where the plaintiff's lawyers will bring claims against, this company or that company. You don't see those pursued under HIPAA.
Right.
Instead, and we'll talk a little bit about this, where the world is headed in this arena. Instead, you see them trying to expand the ability to provide to bring lawsuits under other theories, but they're all kind of bootstrapped on HIPAA, especially if there's a security incident or security compromise.
Great. So now, Tim, I'm going to bring it over to you. What Scott talked about. Can you talk about the HIPAA security and privacy rules? What they are and how you work with them.
Absolutely. So let me tag on to a little bit of what Scott said too about what HIPAA does, and there's many things it doesn't. The watch example is a great one. Doesn't really deal with that. That's your information. You are not, quote, a covered entity. Scott, I believe, referred to that. You have to cover your own self, if you will. And also HIPAA and high tech establish minimums standards. And one of the things that was very clear, even from the offset of the legislation in 96, when we first got this going, is they are minimum standards. So states have the right to pass more constrained, more strict rules and regulations. And some states have opted to do that. It's actually quite a challenge, and we've been discovering this, and that's why every year there's attempts to modify HIPAA. Some of that is through legislation, some of it's through regulation. The Office of the National Coordinator for Health Information Technology is sort of in the center seat when it comes to how these are applied when it comes to covered entities. But you pointed out two great things. There's a difference between security and privacy. Privacy deals more with the data itself and the rights to the data, who can have data and who can't. It's one of the reasons that people get very annoyed when they walk into a doctor's office or a hospital and they have to sign a lot of forms with lots of print that, pardon me, Scott, other attorneys may have come up with in regards to trying to manage the risk of an organization with HIPAA rules and regulations. And that is certainly one thing. The challenge with that, though, is like most laws, there are unintended consequences. And one of them was that consumers' ability to access their own health information was somewhat constrained because not so much necessarily by particulars of the legislation, there's arguments for possibly that, but also because organizations hate risk. Hospitals, where I've worked most of my career, don't want risk. And so we will shut things up as tight as we can to avoid risk, as long as it doesn't affect the business, if you will, and the delivery of care, which frankly under HIPAA the delivery of care and the operations of healthcare are excluded from actually issues around the use of information, the privacy issues. Anything you need to do with patient information generally is allowable for healthcare covered entities if they're using it for patient care, if they're using it for the operations to deliver patient care. Now, there's lots of ways that has gotten into conversations and probably legislation, or not legislations, actual debates in terms of even court discussions, but I'll leave that maybe for Scott to talk about. Instead, let me float to the other side, which is security for a second. And security, what's happened here is there is an aspect of the data that is touched by the security element as well, dealing with data in lots of places, at rest, when it's in storage, if you will. And HIPAA talks a lot, as does high tech, about the need for encryption, the requirement for encryption to actually provide cover in terms of risk. But it also talks about data in transit when it's moving between systems, which again impacts privacy and security because shockingly, healthcare systems are not monolithic in their care for a person. There's a continuum of care that happens. And that means healthcare organizations like long-term care, pharmacies, your physician office, hospitals need to share information. And all of that sharing information is governed under these laws about security and privacy and what and how. So it gets fairly messy pretty quickly.
Okay, that was a great setup for our next topic. And that's really, let's talk about current updates in healthcare regulations. And I'm going to go here. We're going to talk first about current trends and updates in HIPAA and high tech. And Scott, I'm going to bring this to you. The current issues popping up with information blocking. Can you speak to that first? Talk about what we mean by information blocking, and then talk about the current, proposed changes that are coming down the pike, actually in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, and we have a team of folks here at the firm that focus a lot of efforts right now on information blocking. So in short, information blocking is a federal rule that's about to come live that seeks to prevent organizations in the healthcare space from preventing the flow of data between organizations for the care of a patient. And as Tim was mentioning, you have this very significant dichotomy in the healthcare space. On the one hand, you have these obligations and needs to secure data. And I mean, this is present in a hospital hallway, right? Where you'd see a laptop or a workstation sitting open that gets rolled from one room to the next. And that workstation has incredible access to patient information. It needs to be mobile, it needs to be accessible, and it needs to be accessible quickly. On the other hand, it's put at great risk as it's rolling through a public hallway of a hospital. And information blocking is trying to address some of this dichotomy where moving data is in itself inherently risky, right? A lot of us would love to see data just sit still in encrypted form and never move. It's a lot easier to protect. And information blocking is trying to get at that by creating some boundaries around what can and can't be done with electronic health records and what patients' ability is addressable by the patient. Can they move data from, say, one hospital organization to another freely? And can that hospital organization that's transferring the data out create bases for preventing that from happening? And so that's the information blocking rule at about 200,000 feet. In terms of security risk and privacy risk, it presents the whole myriad of issues and confrontations to the electronic health records, to the providers, to the plans, to the patients. It's a bit of a soup.
Yeah, and on this, with the whole, the proposed changes, it's actually for the patient, right? Easier access to information, the ability to share that information. But with that comes a whole host of problems. And I'll pass that over to Tim. As a CIO or a CISO at a hospital, how are you going to get compliant with this? Because now, you're pretty much opening up access to third-party apps or other companies or supply chain or whatever.
And you have to, because those are businesses that you are doing business with. And if you don't exchange some information, you've got a problem. So there's a lot of work that you can do ahead of time to secure patient information. And I think we'll get into that in just a second. But I will say this past year has highlighted a number of challenges in this very area that we're talking about. Actually, in HHS, Health and Human Services, who's responsible for all of the work around this for healthcare, actually knew this even before going into COVID. They are responsible for doing audits on HIPAA compliance. And one of the audit reports that came out, actually it came out in December, but the data, this past December, but the data was even before that, shows that most healthcare organizations aren't in full compliance with the minimum requirements for HIPAA right now in terms of security standards. So what does it take? Frankly, it takes a layered approach, and a layered approach is not new to the security realm. Whether if you're a CISO, that's what you do. Everything from the insurance side for when you have to, cover what's happened and sort of building back from it, to the preemptive side, which is as basic sometimes as firewalls and antivirus, but also can involve many other layers, such as intrusion detection, such as proactive monitoring of all data flows that are going in and out of your organization. The number of tools actually that we have more at our disposal today than when, certainly from when HIPAA started, but even in the past year that continue to develop, that frankly are learning tools that leverage a lot of the best of AI capabilities that weren't so much leveraged by companies. It's pretty phenomenal. But why this last year? I mean, I think there's two primary reasons this last year, though, has really brought these issues even more front and center, beyond who was in compliance and who wasn't. One is that we've seen a push and need to put technology and information more quickly out in more places. If you think of what happened with COVID, we all of a sudden had to send many care providers to their homes. Yes, we were still running acute care facilities, but a lot of the ambulatory processes went to the homes of care providers. So most of the CIOs I know and that our organization deals with were having to deploy thousands and thousands of laptops and mobile devices to the homes of care providers so that they could access patient information from their homes. And if you think what that means in terms of extending your network, yes, use VPNs, yes, use tokens, yes, use all these things for identity management, role management, yes, but you're still increasing the risk exponentially through what you're doing. And many of these organizations were also using technologies that weren't designed to handle the security requirements. And frankly, HHS has given waivers to this. They have said it's okay for now because you have to treat patients, you have to do this, we're responding to a pandemic. So what we sometimes refer to as telehealth or telemedicine, which is the extension of care beyond where the care provider is. We've been using over the last years a lot of technologies that aren't as secure. And we've had essentially waivers from HHS about that under HIPAA and high tech. And those are probably going to continue through this year. But it is a challenge because once you've let the genie out of the bottle, if you will, once patients are used to receiving care in their homes or not having to travel, or care providers are used to delivering care from their homes, that's the desire. People want that convenience, and then we have to sort of clean up a bit of the mess that's been created from the security aspect. So that's one of the two major regions. I'll mention the other piece real quick, and then I'll let us keep going. But the other is, frankly, over the last year, we've seen a ramp up in cybersecurity threats to healthcare specifically. I've been on calls with the FBI, other Homeland Security entities over the past year multiple times where they have been alerting internally the healthcare community to the fact that there are specific known and credible threats. And those have shown up. And we'll talk more about that, I'm sure. But those are two big reasons why over the last year, essentially, there's been a ramp up in focus on this by healthcare providers, health systems, and frankly, by HHS.
Yeah, and on that, and I'll go to Scott on this, like what you just highlighted is there's a relaxation of rules. Now we're going to share more information, but then you're coming back to the organization saying you need to have best practices in place and you have to work with your supply chain. And Scott, I'll let you speak to the issues that an organization or a CIO or a CISO is going to have in trying to get all that done now.
Yeah, and Kevin, the challenge is there's a relaxation on the control of an organization has over the data that it's the custodian for. So you know, an organization collects, say a hospital collects data on behalf of its patients. That hospital arguably in the coming days, weeks, and months may have obligations to put that data in transit that it didn't have before, without a lot of recourse, right? And without the ability to say, are you sure you really want to transfer the data over to that organization? And so there's immediate concern, you know, from a legal liability perspective of, am I going to be insulated if I transfer that data over there and that organization loses it, or the data is lost in transit, but after it leaves my organization's infrastructure? And these are things that are going to have to be addressed either by additional regulations and laws or by the courts, and I suspect probably by the latter. And so there's those risks. And there was a really fascinating case that came out of the Fifth Circuit, which is Texas. It's a federal court, an appeals court earlier this year, about interpreting the disclosure rule and the encryption rule, privacy and security rules under HIPAA and HITECH, talking about what it means to be encrypted and what it means to disclose. And not surprisingly, the Fifth Circuit looks very specifically at the language that's chosen by Congress and the implementing rules to find that it's not about having encryption, it's about having a mechanism to encrypt. And MD Anderson Hospital was fined, you know, $4.5 million because of 3 different security incidents, which were somewhat routine, but presented a lot of risk. The lost laptop, the stolen thumb drive that was encrypted, the misplaced USB drive that had 2,000 clinical patient files on it. And these are issues that are only going to continue, let alone what Tim was talking about, which are the new risks or the newer risks, you know, the proliferation of ransomware attacks in the healthcare industry or the provider industry, including the small surgical center in your neighborhood community center, or the provider organization, either in the big city or in the small town. It is so easy now to to build ransomware. It's available for sale on the internet, to implement it, and to obtain a ransom. And you can get away with crime these days that you couldn't get away with 10 or 15 years ago, and steal very sensitive data. They used to just focus on banking data or credit cards because it was immediately monetized, right? But now, you know, sometimes that health information is so much better. You can actually monetize that because it's the full suite of data you need to conduct identity theft, if that's your objective as a criminal.
Yeah, so before we get into, I'm glad you brought up ransomware. I'm going to throw that to Tim in a second, but I don't want to miss out on this. And one of the updates that recently came out in January was dealing with security programs. And this is, you know, when you talk about security, and Tim deals with this, I'm sure, and you deal with this all the time, Scott, is the regulators often talk about we want you to follow the NIST framework, or we want you to follow the ISO standards, or whatever practices are out there. They say, just be reasonable. And there's been an issue of like, what do you mean by reasonable? And they come back and say, we'll tell you what we mean by reasonable if there's a breach and there's an issue with what you're doing. A recent update just came out that now talks about recognized security practices, that if a hospital or an entity covered by HIPAA, if they use the NIST publications and framework, the cybersecurity framework, they're going to, you know, within the last 12 months, that's going to be considered a mitigating factor, you know, for them. And do you see this, and, you know, going to Scott, and I'm sure this is helpful for Tim in one aspect, but do you see this as kind of like the codification or a move to recognition that, like, okay, we're going to use the NIST framework. We're not going to say it because Congress isn't coming out with anything, but you see it here with HIPAA, and then you see it with the CMMC, which is the cybersecurity maturation model certification under the DoD. You know, they came out and said, hey, if you want to do work with us as a contractor, this is what you have to do. I just want to get your quick thoughts on that.
Is that for Tim or for me?
No, that's for you. I'm going to let Tim jump into ransomware. I saw him jumping ready to jump on this.
So, well, so listen, there's different approaches to regulating behavior, right? And you're trying to ultimately get to the right result. there's the regulation by enforcement, which is, I think, largely what we've been experiencing through high tech since 2009. When you have a security incident, you have to notify HHS, their Office of Civil Rights, and all the details go up on the internet on their security breach page. And then the plaintiff's lawyers troll that page and they bring a lawsuit. And okay, we learned the lesson. But I personally think that that's not the way to actually secure the country and its data infrastructure. I think that's kind of whacking a mole one at a time. I think providing incentives like the safe harbor that you're talking about for actually building a legitimate cybersecurity program, which would include not just technical controls, but governance, compliance, risk, legal, right? Audit, HR, you'd have the full suite of control functions available at whatever organization you're addressing. To me, you're certainly going to raise the bar for security. And you're probably going to bring a better level of attention to it. So I like the carrot and stick approach. One wonders what's going to happen with enforcement actions. Those are often driven politically with the new administration. And one wonders where it's going to go with the courts. But in the meantime, I like the idea of providing carrots to those organizations that are truly investing in security, not just the data, but the infrastructure that holds it.
Yeah, and Tim, from a technical standpoint, do you see this as helpful for you and give you more direction, or is it more, I'll worry about the lawyers that are doing this, I'm protecting the data and networks regardless?
Actually, one of the things that my organization does is we work in DC we work directly with ONC, but we work also with Congress to try to actually help introduce regulations and laws. And one of these relaxations was really important because their clarity helps. It always helps to have clarity about what is a path that will allow protection. Because as I mentioned, and this was mentioned by Scott as well, the risk element is still what drives a lot of the behavior within healthcare. That no one wants the stick that Scott was mentioning. It can be a stick. In fact, in many cases, that can drive you out of business. And so, and it was actually just this past December that HR, let me see if I get it right, 7898 passed, which is actually and was signed into law as President Trump was going out, that actually gave credit for cyber best practices to providers. And that was a huge thing that we have been working on now and pushing for in DC. And so we were really celebrating that because frankly, you can do everything right and things still go wrong. And if things go wrong, you could still be exposed to all the sticks in the world beating you up, if you will. So whether you were following NIST or whether you were following any other framework, no matter what layers you put in place, and things do go wrong. So when things go wrong, how exposed are you in terms of risk is very, very big. And so being able to say we follow best practices becomes a statement and a defense, if you will. Not that I want to get into the courtroom, but a defense for breaches or other exposure of data that can happen. And that is a huge relief for healthcare providers who are not, their first line of business is not cybersecurity. They are, in fact, cybersecurity for healthcare providers has been particularly challenging because getting resources, we are under-resourced with cybersecurity resources in this country, in the world. But for a hospital who's trying to deliver care, whether small, medium, or large, if you're doing everything you can, but it's still not enough, that's hard. And I know we may get into ransomware here, but and you can just search the headlines. We've seen a small rural system completely lose everything to ransomware. They had to rebuild completely their entire EHR, their electronic health record, from scratch, essentially, because of a ransomware event. And
to interrupt real quick, because just in case, everyone's seen this in the paper, but what do you mean by ransomware? Quickly.
Okay, so ransomware, is a type of attack that essentially can come in from a lot of different vectors, a lot of sources. It can be phishing, it can be spear phishing. We can get into those terms if people want to, or it can just be straight hacking. But what happens is code is loaded on a system that encrypts the data on that system. So it may be that one drive, multiple drives, but essentially it encrypts data in a way that it cannot be accessed by the owner of the data without a key that the hacker, that the ransomware author provides. And so they will typically request a payment, often now in Bitcoin. That's the favorite payment methodology these days, to provide you the key that unlocks your own data. Now, there's a lot of problems with that, including that even if you get attacked, your data is encrypted, you can't access it, and they give you and say, just send me 2 Bitcoin, and you pay it, and then they unencrypt it. How do you know you're done? Because typically they're going to leave something on your system. They can re-encrypt it. That can be a window into your data that they can still access. Your system's been compromised. Your data's been compromised. And from there, it's really difficult with all the forensics in the world to actually know then what. So
yeah,
hopefully that helps answer.
That was perfect. No, that was a great explanation. So Scott, we know what ransomware is. Where's the target coming in here? How are they getting in? Is it through the employees, the supply chain, the patients? How is this happening?
Yeah, all the above. If you can dream it, they're getting in that way. We've seen instances where they got in through a fax machine that mistakenly was connected to a Wi-Fi that was connected to the cloud medical record provider, and they got into the instance of the EHR instance that the medical facilities were using. And so it's really all of the above. There can't be enough training for human beings, and there can't be enough detection on your technology to try to identify it and prevent it. It's as sophisticated as ever based on from my seat. We're seeing ransomware that has the ability to not just encrypt, but to extract or exfiltrate data with ease. We've seen ransomware used to cover up, not just to get the extortion or the payment, but to cover up larger data breaches, where they're encrypting kind of the breadcrumb trails that we would typically follow with forensic investigators to see what happened and who it was and what did they take. And we're seeing instances where there's double ransom demand. So they demand that you pay for the key to get access back to your data or to your infrastructure that's been encrypted. Mm-hmm. And then they'll also demand that you pay them a ransom, otherwise they're going to go public. And some of these organizations have websites, not on the dark web, but on Google, the regular web. And they're shaming organizations, saying we have all of their patient data and they're not paying us to get it back, so we're going to put it up on the internet. And the demands, we used to think that single digit millions was large. We see that now all the time. We saw one recently where the first demand was north of 5, the second demand was north of 10. It's a big game. So it's dangerous.
Yeah, and we talked earlier about, and Tim talked about, okay, there's a relaxation of rules. You have people spread out outside the hospitals or the organizations. There's a risk out there. And what we've been talking about, and I think, Tim, you talked about giving us some examples on this. It's not only the threat, and this, Scott, too, to the personal data, to my healthcare data. It's also the threat to the systems and actually my healthcare. They could hold a whole hospital hostage, and you're talking about loss of life. So, Tim, do you want to jump in here and give us some examples of where you've seen this play out?
Yeah, and I think, let me emphasize and underline, though, what you just said, coming in from anywhere, and Scott mentioned this as well. Anything that has access to a network via, whether it's wireless or wired, any access. So this isn't just your PC or servers, or right. This is also medical devices. Every single medical device that exists, just about pumps, smart pumps that infuse medication, all of these have computers inside. I mean, that's how these work. And so all of these can be compromised. In fact, most devices, including, again, I feel like we're going to give people I don't know, that we're going to give them, I don't want to give heart attacks or nightmares or anything like that. But there's been demonstrations of compromises even of pacemakers, because if it has chips, if it has software, it can be compromised. And so, this is, in fact, there was one of the ransomware incidents. There was a hospital in Germany that had a ransomware attack. And because of this, they weren't able to access information on the patient that was being admitted. They were trying to transfer it to another facility, and the patient died in the process. That was the first incident that was publicly known about a actual death attributable to ransomware in this case, but attributable to the kinds of security issues that we're talking about. But these incidents are happening all the time. Every day, these attacks are coming against all parts of the healthcare sector. And there is, in many cases, there is a upfront monetary motivation involved, sometimes by these hackers. But I also don't want to let go of what Scott said about the access to the data. The data is really the most important thing, and that's what they're going after ultimately. And this kind of data has high value, and it's getting to be deeper and deeper kinds of data. We're now getting into the storage and use of genetic data. And those kinds of data points are also of significant concern, and in many cases aren't covered. If I, as a consumer, am giving my healthcare or genetic data to someone, that's not covered by HIPAA, it's not covered by high tech, it's not covered in any way. One big example, 23andMe. If you've gone out and done that test, that company's FBI will tell you this, they're based in China. That data, your data is all in China. And China has been one of the biggest collectors of healthcare data through whatever approach that you want to think of that we've seen. And that's genetic data, that's health data, that's other data. And that's a that's real. And there's much documented about it. So it's not that there's some, pardon me, I don't know, 12-year-old, 14-year-old kid in the garage, hammering against your firewalls. That happens, but mostly a lot of what we're seeing is either attributable to organized crime or nation state actors. And this is even more worrisome because of the amount of resources they bring to bear when they attack. And that's a real challenge right now.
All right, we have a question, first question from the audience. Who's responsible for medical device cybersecurity? Question, FDA question?
So, well, Scott, I don't know, Scott and I, actually,
Go ahead.
I'm going to like the answer I'm going to give first is everyone should be, meaning the manufacturer has liability in this. In terms of oversight, yes, FDA, and there's actually other parties too, but even on the receiving end, if I had a hospital and receiving medical equipment, I have an obligation to check that equipment. I need to do everything I can to make sure what's brought into my facility is safe. So obligations stretch on a continuum, but I'm going to let the attorney answer at this point too. So.
No, I agree with that. I would say principally, I would turn to the FDA on that. So if you have a FDA regulated device, say some sort of pump that attaches to the human body and it's FDA regulated, that's going to be your principal regulator for security risks. They have security guidance. They're continuing to work on that, and they are, I would say, well informed on security risks. Mm-hmm. If you break down, there's a lot of kind of chat in the legal space and the cyber space about the amount of risk that sits out there because they're connected devices. They're often small. The chips are small. How do you put security inside of them without potentially compromising how the devices work? These are all things that I think industry is working on.
And if I could tap into one other thing there has been a persistent myth out there about the FDA, and that is sometimes you still hear it. I heard it in my years as a CIO, and it's still heard occasionally, where a manufacturer, where you as a purchaser of a medical device from a manufacturer will hear from maybe the sales or marketing or some other part of the manufacturer's organization that, well, this is the device, we can't because we have to, go through a process with the FDA if we're going to update anything on the device. So the fact that it has Windows CE as an operating system isn't something that, so you get those kinds of statements. Here's the reality. the FDA calls that, well, they call it not true. They throw the card on that because there is not a restriction that the FDA puts on security updates to devices in terms of these testing processes that you have to go through. So if you hear as a security or IT or person out there, something from and I'm not going to name all the device companies, but any device company, any medical device company that says, well, we can't update because we have to go through some delay with the, no, that's not true at all. So don't buy that.
Excellent. All right. I'm going to move us along.
Yeah.
Our next spot, incident response mitigation. All right. So you're hit, and this is great. I usually don't have an attorney and a CIO on the same panel. Usually I have like one or the other. So this is great. So I want to see, you're hit with a ransomware attack. What do you do? So first I'll go to Scott. Like, what happens? You're representing a hospital. There's a ransomware attack. Where do you come in? What happens?
Well, hopefully early we come in as the lawyer. So hopefully we're, one of the first 3 or 4 phone calls to say we've got this issue going on, and here's the team, and we need a couple of extra folks to support us. Mm-hmm. And lawyers, here's why you need a lawyer along the way, because a lot of people ask us that, and here's why we think you need lawyers. So there's going to be legal risk immediately presented. So, for example, 2016 HHS OCR puts out kind of a talking points guidance saying any ransomware impacting regulated PHI or HIPAA data is automatically deemed a security incident that's reportable. Okay, well, I've got views on that as a lawyer, and I think the circumstances of what's happened actually are important there, but you have legal risk. You also have internal governance risk. So who needs to know? When do they need to know? Can you tell entities outside the organization? Can you call the FBI as quickly as some of the people on the team want you to? And if you do, what do you tell them? And can you call law enforcement before you, say, notify the chairman of the audit committee of your organization? There are a lot of missteps that could be made. And so, we're doing that in the first 10 minutes after we're getting called. Helping to assemble a team is something else that, lawyers who are trained to do this can do. Your lawyers aren't making the decisions immediately. They're advising. Lawyers who want to come in and say, I've seen this 40 times this month, and here's what you have to do, I would say get yourself a new lawyer. You want lawyers who are going to come in and work with your either internal incident response team, your CIO, your CTO, the technical team that knows the infrastructure that's going to be able to help mitigate the risk. That's all you're focused on. Contain and mitigate the risk as quickly as you can. There are things that people do. A lot of people will say, let's unplug all the systems. And the lawyers might say, we can't unplug them. Can we take them offline? We tend to prefer power running to those if we can get them offline. If you can't get them offline, then I'd say go for it, unplug it, and I'll deal with the legal risks to help you have to unplug it to try to stop the proliferation of the ransomware because it's spreading like a worm usually. So those are all things we're doing, and then we're giving the organization some protection in their decision making through attorney-client or work product protection. So privileges, legal privileges, which hopefully isn't as important at the end of the day, but if you need it, it can be absolutely critical to protecting the decision making.
And Scott, a key to all of this is I'm a hospital or provider. I shouldn't be getting a data breach and then calling you saying like, hey, Scott Lashway, I just saw you at Boston College. Can you help me out here? I need a lawyer. I think it should be well beforehand, correct?
That's the hope. That's the hope, though. I also don't mind those other phone calls if you need one. Yeah, I mean, with that said, you really need to go to somebody who does this for a living. I don't mean to pick on my own industry, but everybody's a security lawyer now because it's in the papers, and It's a cool thing. And there are a lot of great security lawyers out there, not just at my firm, but at a lot of places, big, small, expensive, cheaper. You can get them kind of in all colors, stripes, and sizes, but you want someone who's been around this world for a while, who's not figuring it out live.
All right. No, that's great advice. And all right, Tim, you're the CIO or you're the CISO, and there's a breach. What are you doing, and how are you interacting with everyone there?
Well, I'll tag on first on what Scott said, because if you are that CIO or CISO who's just, when it happens, trying to figure out what to do, you should be fired. That shouldn't ever happen. You have to have a plan.
Right.
You don't just have to have a plan. You have to have a tested plan, one that you repeatedly test through tabletop exercises, through integrated drills with all parts of your organization, including risk, including legal, that you're going through this as a process, not just once a year, but multiple times a year, because this is that significant of a threat. And, you know, that plan can involve a lot of things. Unplugging the power is, that is a fairly big, I don't want to call it last resort, but that's a big fallback. You do want to have an architecture in your organization, an IT architecture that allows you to manage risk appropriately. That can talk. What is that? Well, that can be the multi-layered security solutions I mentioned, but it can also be segmentation of your networks in such a way that you can appropriately quarantine risk where needed. It may be that you need to quarantine your organization from the internet, the outside access if you need, but you can't do that if you don't even know who has access. There's a number of those medical devices that call home for updates and things like that. And if that's a risk area that's actually been impinged upon here, you've got a problem. And even before that, even before the technical, what is the biggest risk? It's actually the people in your organization. The entry points for ransomware, yes, they can be hacks. Certainly you have to keep up all your patching on all your software, not just your security software, but your EHR software, your infrastructure software, operations software. You have to have a patching program that keeps that up to date. And yes, there's zero-day attacks, and the patch won't necessarily prevent that at all, unless it's a weird cousin of something you've patched for, but that's using a different kind of metaphor. But you have to prepare your people as well. I have the failure rates of people and if you're not doing, if you will, phishing attacks on your own organization where you're testing, they're test fish and spearfish even testing, you're not doing what you need to in terms of preparation. You need to train your people to do the right thing when it comes to protection of data. And that includes not giving away their access credentials.
And on that, when you say train your people, this is a good point. You're not just talking about your security staff. You're talking about everyone throughout the whole enterprise.
Security is everyone's job.
Right.
Security is everyone's job. In fact, as you even help patients to access their own data through portals or internal methods, it's even talking about training those patients to make sure they understand that their information is protected and how to make sure they keep it protected even as they go home from the hospital, if you will. So security is everyone's job. And in fact, everyone in your organization should receive training when they first enter your organization and have to demonstrate knowledge about HIPAA, about high tech, about how to treat data, about how to use technology. It doesn't matter. I'm not talking IT people. I'm talking doctors, nurses, revenue cycle people. Everyone should receive that training. It should be documented they've received it, because this is a requirement. And you should have repeat training, annual at minimum, but involve them as well in your test, involve them in proactive education, and involve them in reactive education. If they do something wrong, like on one of your internal phishing tests, they click and they enter information. That is an absolute opportunity to deliver just-in-time education about what just happened and how to not do it again.
Perfect. And when you're working on this, again, you're not siloed. You know, you're working with, Scott's the attorney, you're working with the attorney, you're working with your board, you're working with the business unit, and you're working with,
that community aspect's critical. Let me if we can
in.
just sit there for a second, Kevin, it's really critical. I mean, even whether it's, yes, it's all those relationships you have, it's attorneys, it's risk, it's your insurance providers. It is your board. Your board has an obligation to be informed about these things. It is your community. And frankly, it's law enforcement. If you're not already and have relationships or in communications with Homeland Security, FBI, if your security team doesn't already have those relationships, they need to get them now. Those organizations want those relationships, and they are going to be very helpful. There is also coordinating councils, or healthcare sector coordinating council that helps coordinate efforts in healthcare under HHS around best practices, around communication. They give alerts, they do webinars. You can participate even in helping to set some of these standards. Get involved. It is a community effort. There's no way a security organization can do this on their own. It has to be a connection broadly. The HISACs, the information threat intelligence organizations that are out there. You have to be in tune with these other organizations in the broader healthcare IT security community, or you're not doing your job.
Excellent. All right. Well, we have
Kevin, can I just note one thing there?
Yes, please.
So from a lawyer's perspective, you need to be very careful when you have an incident going outside of your organization without authority. As an employee of an organization, you have a duty of loyalty under just about any state law for which you personally are responsible. So if you have a security incident and you call, the friend over at the FBI and say, hey, don't tell anybody, but here's what I've got going on, you potentially have a big problem on your hands as an employee of that organization. I think as organizations continue to see this risk, they're going to start cracking down on the open sharing of security risk that some organizations follow and some don't. I have lots of views on whether it's a good idea or a bad idea, but you want to just be very cautious on what you're sharing, even on a no names basis. It's easy to figure out who's calling.
And I won't start a fight because I love Scott and I love attorneys, and I don't disagree actually. But what I would point to is absolutely, and what should happen to preclude that kind of problem is you should have prepared, you should have policies, you should have procedures, you should have an approved approach to all these things you do, so that the organization, as the organization, has had an opportunity through its governance structures to approve appropriate controls and to approve appropriate processes and policies, so that you as a CISO or CIO, the security leader, know what's expected, what you're supposed to do, and people have already been engaged in supporting you to do that right thing for the organization.
Excellent. All right. Well, we have a few minutes left, so I'll do the quick wrap up and then we'll take questions. So here's what I got out of this. Cybersecurity is everyone's job. Have a plan, test that plan, train your employees, and have a lawyer. And if you don't have one, call Scott after this conference. All right.
That's what this was all about.
There you go. IBM has an incredible cyber range that trains people on incident response to ransomware attacks. That's from Raman Putman. That is true. And if you were in my class, you'd be able to go there on April 29th to experience and go through a simulation. So there you go. Sign up for the program. There's another plug. Tim, we'll get you next. All right. I have seen examples of blockchain securing biodata. What are you seeing about new and novel techniques that are being considered or being tested to secure that data? Thanks. And that's from Tristan Johnson.
So I can jump in a little bit on that. Blockchain is actually very promising in terms of how we're seeing it applied. What we've primarily seen it used to date for is in the pharmaceutical arena, being able to assure the chain of trust as pharmaceuticals are moved through that, so that you're assured on the receiving end of the pharmaceutical you have is what was sent and originally manufactured versus something that's been contaminated. So blockchain identification has been used for that. We are seeing some other novel applications, particularly when it comes to the identification of actual patient IDs. One of the things that we've been trying to advocate for a long time is the use of a national patient identifier, so that we actually know that when you show up, that who you are versus someone else with your name, your birth date, or any other characteristics that might get you confused with someone else, because we want to treat you for the treatment you need, not for somebody else's, because that wouldn't be particularly good. So we've seen applications for blockchain in patient identification as well. And, you know, this is still in a bit of a nascent place. There's a lot of startups who are grabbing a hold of this. Some of the more established healthcare IT organizations are looking at it, but haven't introduced it broadly to the extent that I've seen, outside of maybe the chain of trust and trying to see how it might integrate and play with the identification issue. But I don't know, Scott, you may have seen some other things.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not particularly bullish on blockchain for this purposes. You know, we're seeing articles coming out in the financial services space where the blockchain is actually being exposed and compromised, such that cryptocurrencies are being routinely stolen now. And they're actually getting access to the ledger, which creates the chain, which creates the blockchain. So I just don't know. I think there will be some technology. One place I think is interesting with blockchain is, instead of using just simple encryption, could you leave the data at rest and use blockchain to call into the data and use that for transfer purposes? We're seeing that tested in other privacy realms with respect to GDPR, the European law preventing transatlantic conveyance of data, whether we can use blockchain to leave the data in Europe, but somehow be able to read it here in the US without violating international laws. So yeah, Tim, I agree. I think there are some exciting days ahead, that maybe some technologies to help eliminate or at least reduce some of the risk.
Excellent. Well,
Yep.
Our time is up here. So thank you, Tim, and thank you, Scott. This was a fascinating panel. We could have probably gone on for about 10 hours. We just touched, the tip of the iceberg here. And for everyone on board, we have our next webinar coming up in April. I think it's April 22nd. It's the intersection of cybersecurity and national security. It's with Mackenzie Queenan, who's the Assistant U.S. Attorney with the U.S. Attorney's Office Cybercrime Unit here in Boston, and Professor Joanna Baltus, who before joining BC was a prosecutor with the Department of Justice, Senior Advisor to the U.S. Attorney General for National Security, and Chief of Staff for the Deputy Director of the FBI. So it should be a fun one. Hope to see you then. And again, Scott and Tim, awesome work. Go Eagles, and thanks so much. We'll see you.
Awesome.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Take care.